to take it, realizing fully, however, that with the breadth of technology and the various locations that everyone will be, that making specific recommendations will definitely fall short of your expectations. So please bear with me as we go through this. There may be some generalities given, but I hope to get a little more specific as we go on. Well, let's just get started. And for those of you who don't know me, I'm very straightforward in my approach on these things. So the intent is for you to get information. If you're not getting it, I have a very good friend there that's on the chat line, and she can help as I continue, or at the end of this I'll be glad to try and fill in. So and my very good friend is Christine Skelly. Well, the first question that came to my mind that I'd have to ask you, the attendees of this, is do you really have a pasture? Because we're going to talk about pasture management, and quite honestly, many of us are guilty, myself included, certain times of the year, that really do not have a pasture. Pasture has to supply growing forage. And so we have to be honest with ourselves of whether or not we even have a pasture. In some parts of the U.S. we'll have a pasture the majority of the year. Even with good pasture management, we will not have pasture in other locations just because of the temperature environments and such. Small acreages obviously may best be termed a turnout, and I would say that's probably the most frequent question that I receive from all of my clientele in this area is what type of grass can I plant in my pasture. And after assessing their land area and the number of horses, they really can't put anything organic out there. Asphalt sometimes is the only way we can go to keep erosion out of the way. So on the other hand, some of the areas of the country are ranges, and there's not a lot of pasture management that can be or even should be done on these pastures. I can remember having a quiz activity with some national FFA members, and one of the questions we were discussing was pasture management and stocking rates and such. And he presented back to me from the part of Montana that he came from, pasture stocking rates are really not an issue because the horses just roam to find any kind of grass whatsoever. But basically, for the definition of our discussion this evening, is that pastures are going to be land, and unfortunately land that must be managed if we're going to supply growing forage. So I guess that's the agreement that we have to make before we get started. You know, are we going to manage this? Okay, well, the objectives of pasture management and the objectives of this talk then. First, you've got to develop a grazing strategy that fits your situation. Grazing strategies are going to be very specific to the location, the land area, the forage production potential of the land, the number of horses that you have. So you have to first initialize what your grazing constraints are going to be in order to have any type of pasture growth through the entire growing season. If you get a grazing strategy that fits your situation, then you're going to move into developing a management routine that actually promotes forage as much or more so than the needs for the horse to get out of the stall or to be managed within a certain area because of all the other factors of management. You basically have to turn into a grassologist more than a horseman. And then obviously the goal is combine these strategies in your grass management routines is going to develop pasture management systems. the vast majority of situations that we have require controlled grazing, and they require some type of supplemental agronomic practice if we're going to have grass management. One without the other is just simply not going to work, so we have to invest in both. So why bother with pastures versus just having a turnout or just letting the grass fall wherever it goes? Well, regardless of the ration scheme, energy systems for our horse diets are fiber based. Fiber is one type of carbohydrate. The other would be non-structural carbohydrates, what we typically talk about in terms of starches and sugars. Horses will do very well when fiber is maximized as a portion of the diet, and that will allow us to have less reliance on some of the other sources of carbohydrates and reliance on supplemental programs of supplying grain and hay. So that in itself promotes a lot of interest in pastures. We also potentially have a lot of health benefits because of the form of energy that is supplied, or I should say prevention of problems, because fiber is a little safer feed source than some of the non-structural carbohydrates. If we have the land, we're also going to consider it to be cost effective. We'll talk more about that in a moment, but if we have the land and we're paying for that land value, it usually comes out economically advantageous for us to consider all the improvement potential that there is. Now, those of us with pastures know that we're in a great situation compared to our counterparts that are just in the stables. Horses respond, as we all know, extremely well to daily access to free exercise, and when they're allowed access, they will forage and move around available land area. So that's regardless of it being a turnout, range, or pasture. So the nutritional value of fiber, which fiber is the main carbohydrate in forages, the nutritional value can vary tremendously because fiber is such a broad range of compounds. It's almost on one extreme of being the woody type structures like trees and shrubs and browse, all the lignin type compounds, almost to that extreme, all the way to fibers that behave very similarly to the non-structural carbohydrates, the starches and sugars. They behave similarly in terms of their ability to be digested and utilized by the horse. So we have a very large range. Some are very digestible and some are not. The amount and type of fiber is going to vary tremendously between grasses, and even more so between the stage of growth of the specific plant. As plants mature, the amount of cell wall is going to increase, and fiber is primarily located within the cell walls as compared to the inside of the cells. So as plants mature, cell wall fibrous compounds go up as a percentage of the plant. These fibers are, as a rule, less digestible than the other types of carbohydrates, so that is one reason why we have to be concerned about management and trying to establish a particular growth stage of plant that's going to allow the horse to have at least moderate digestibility. We supply quite a bit of inputs on management and products to emphasize this quality. And when we're talking about quality, for the largest concern is going to be in digestibility. Talk a little bit more about digestibility later. Now, problems, we don't probably need to spend much time on this. This is one of our great, quote, pastures that we have at our equestrian unit at OSU. Don't tell them that I put that up there, because we're supposed to be the experts on this. We have overstocked these areas, and the only way we're ever going to bring this grass back is to get the horses completely off. It takes a lot of labor, it takes a lot of facilities, and a lot of expense. And many of our horse owners, at least in Oklahoma, have no desire to put that amount of expense and labor and facilities into it. And as such, it just may simply be undoable, especially when we have that limited acreage, or unfortunately with all of those many horses. Well, let's move into horse pasture logic, and we have to combine yep, Kristen Little, I see that, and fertilizer costs. I couldn't agree with you more. Horse pasture logic, horse sense, and farmer sense. You almost have to be willing to put on a pair of bib overalls and tell people that you drive a tractor, which is a little unique and rare for most of our horse owners as far as our identity. But our goal is to supply horses this safe, nutritious source of diet. And then on top of that, it takes a lot of interest and abilities to know accurately, at least semi-accurately, what level of nutrition the horse is receiving, so we can do knowledgeable supplementation with our grain-based feedstuffs and turn our complete nutritional program around many times, because many of our owners will tie into the grain as being the primary source and that pasture just being the quote filler. We have to completely change that logic around. So we have to know what to expect with grazing habits, and we also have to know what to expect with herd dynamics in terms of horse sense factors. So, moving into grazing habits. Horses are continuous grazers. If you look at the research where there has been documentation of time spent grazing and comparing horses to other species such as cattle, horses will graze longer than most of the other species. Some assume it's an evolutionary deal because they need to consume quite a bit of immature forage versus the mature compared to ruminants to get the same digestibility. Who knows? Point is they're going to graze easily 40 to 50% of the daylight if given the opportunity and given the grass area. Now, they will roam if given the land area. And as they roam, they will select the preferred plants. In a multicultural pasture where we have many different species, they will, as we all know, hunt out whatever the palatable plant is, and palatability is usually associated as much or more with maturity level of the plant than it is from one plant to another. They will prefer plants that are moderate to below moderate in their growth stage. Well, supplemental feed will alter the time spent grazing, and this is where we get into a very limited situation in order to make recommendations. If you're feeding horses grain, which many or most of us do on our pasture situations, they will not spend that 40 to 60% daylight hour time that these feral horses would, or these ponies or whatever out on pasture. They will stand around that feed trough, get very good at knowing what time it is. We all know that, even to the point that they will actually reduce their production capabilities when supplemental feed is fed in some situations when there is good and ample grass to support that production. So it gets to be very tricky and, quite honestly, extremely hard to make a general recommendation, especially when you're feeding them twice a day. You just have to be that herdsman. You have to see what's going on, and if you've got the forage there and you want them to use it, You're going to have to figure out your supplemental feeding strategies that's going to make them want to eat. Making them want to eat is another way of saying they need to be hungry. Okay, herd dynamics will alter the time spent grazing and the minimum space needed for individual horse safety. This affects what we really can do when we move into the next slide or so on controlled grazing. Compared to other animals, herd dynamics, horses are pretty tough with one another many times. So where you might read a certain stocking rate on a controlled grazing situation, it may not work for you because it may not be safe for your herd. But when we're many of us with that are in a situation of small acreages are going to require controlled grazing. That sounds very much like an absolute, but I've been in extension long enough that I can say that. The two methods most easily used with horse pastures are our rotational grazing cells and the limited turnout time. Now, if I get the right button here, there we go. Rotational grazing, I think everybody knows, there's so much information now. 20 years ago, we were just making the push on this and bringing up people from Australia to talk about it and such, and it was a very novel item in our horse world. But all rotational grazing is just taking up our usable pasture and dividing it into smaller grazing cells. Now, we're going to basically allow then this grass an opportunity to recover from grazing before horses are put back on it. So that little box diagram that I have there, the picture of the little horse and the arrow, when the grass is grazed down to a certain level, you move them over to the cell that has had the most relief period. Now, what is a recommendation for grazed down? My agronomist friends will tell me that we want to protect our grasses such that horses or any animal are going to consume at a maximum 30 to 40% of the available forage. So they are very protective of the plant, and they want us to only utilize about, let's say less than half of the available biomass there before we move them out. What does that mean? That may mean in some great situations where the grass is green, the sky's blue, and the rain comes when it's supposed to. We have seen programs where 2 to 3 days per cell works very well, especially if you have a large number of horses and that real lush growth area. On the other hand, it's actually more typical for most of our horse owners and such and most of our environments to expand that to 2 to 3 week period. Rotational grazing has a very definite advantage for the plant and then for the horse. Some of the trials that we have done personally here on forages that don't tolerate good, they don't tolerate heavy grazing. We have actually been able to increase the total days of grazing by roughly 20%, and with that forage availability through the entire growing season, the amount of forage has increased 20 or 30%. So roughly what we send out as guidelines, if the conditions are right and we're dealing with some tender forage or something, we can actually expect a 20 to 30% increase in the amount of forage. So that starts then allowing us to consider the extra cost, labor, time, and working the herd dynamics of using these temporary fencing systems that are so prevalent now. As long as there's a strong perimeter fence, these single type web tapes and such are used pretty frequently to divide up these small acreages. Worst case scenario, they just the electrification quits or something, or you see a horse moved over into a cell where he's not supposed to be. Obviously you wouldn't do it on the perimeter. That would just be your internal cells. Now, manure management and erosion conditions are a concern when we start putting horses on a rotational grazing system, because typically we're going to keep the same number of horses. We're just going to really concentrate them for a short period of time. And so we got to really watch out for erosion, and you're probably going to have to spend some time dragging those pastures more with the drag on the back of the four-wheeler or whatever. Well, the size of the cells and the time length per cell is going to depend on horse numbers, herd dynamics, and plant availability, and it's usually plant availability, the growth pattern of the forage, and the land size that's the limiting factor. Well, limited turnout is a pretty frequent question that we receive. What I mean by that is we have the stalls, we have the pasture, we know that we don't want them to be out there the whole time because they just destroy the limited amount of acreage. How long per day do we need to turn the horses out, or can we expect? And we just go to roll in then into a series of questions of how long does a horse graze? Are you going to be promoting grazing of that, or is the horse going to be full before he's turned out onto it? Well, any recommendation will have to be refined to your observations, but we would recommend for horse health for you to work your pasture management plans to give them a minimum of 4 to 6 hours. That's a good starting point, and that will allow them sufficient time to ingest an appreciable amount of forage, as well as give them what they need for that turnout. So that's a good starting point, and you can just go from there. Whether or not you divide that up into two-hour time periods or whatever, totally up to you. Truthfully, many times we work situations to where we turn them out, we leave, go to work, we come back in at 5 o'clock, and we put them up. May not be the best scenario, but at least we're doing something. Okay, farmer sense and pastures. This is where I wish I had an agronomist tied into to this headset, because you just basically, it's pretty simple. You have to know what will grow. And with the movement of horses and the movement of horse owners all over the U.S., we get a lot of experiential knowledge on forages, but it's specific to the location so much that it's an intense learning curve just because of geographical area. Climate, topography, soil type, it's something that we are usually not trained in as horse owners, but fortunately that information is getting to be more and more easily accessible. Some climates are going to be suited for as much as 300 days of grazing in a perfect year with moisture and such. And others, and I put a limit there of 180 to 240 at best. I suppose if we have anyone from Alaska, that's going to be a little shorter than that. Some areas are suited for cool season plants and other for warm season, and so you will, similar to watching the television programs where they talk about zones for introduced shrubs and such around our landscaping, we have that same type of a zone issue with the types of plants that we're going to work. Topographical maps are invaluable if you have any size of acreage at all. These used to be in the NRCS offices at the county level, these big books and such. They still are in many places. In some places, those books are getting harder and harder to find. But these local Natural Resource Conservation Service offices will have maps, usually now web-based type maps, and very good maps because of the satellite technology that will show you slopes, that will show you drainage patterns, that will show you a lot about the land that you will quite honestly be surprised when you look, when you see it from above. Cooperative extension offices also are good starting points to have this type of information. Quite honestly, when someone calls up and tells me that they have a horse farm in Oklahoma, one of the first things I'll do is Google Earth it and just get a look at what they're talking about. Well, The soil type is so tremendously different from location to location that unless you're willing to do a soil test, the agronomic practices that you'll want to use will at best just be expensive and moderately effective. Soil types greatly affect production rates. Just in one region of our state, there's so many differences in soil type that we will expect the amount of biomass produced per acre to vary just because of these locations of soil from 1 ton per acre through the growing season all the way up to fourfold that on our good soils. So we just have to know what soil type and what the soil nutrient content is that we're dealing with. Soil tests are a must, but they're very dependent upon proper sampling. Utilize a cooperative extension office. Usually they will have one of these probes, as the picture suggests to the bottom right hand part of the screen. When you talk to the agronomists and the plant people, they'll tell you that they'll need on an area, they may need 15 to 20 different samples of certain depths and such. So do that. Be prepared to do it. If nothing else, maybe you can talk them to come out and do it for you. Soil tests are usually very economical. One of the most economical activities that we'll want to do. So let's combine it all and figure out what's going on. We want to do a pasture plan. Well, you have to identify what's currently growing on your pasture. And the reason that you do to start out with is because what is currently growing is probably the most adapted to your soil and such, and that's going to give you a starting point. Fortunately, a lot of our acreages that we have horses on are good soil types and good pastures, and there may not need to be a lot of introduction of different varieties of different grasses and such. We may just be able to utilize what's there. On the reverse, if you're from an area of the country like we're at, we identify what's currently growing, and usually it's a lot of undesirable grasses unless it has been tended to. Identifying forage species adapted to your area and soil type. Hopefully that should just be simple logic, and everybody that ought to be really basic. But we get a lot of questions because of, I guess, marketing efforts of a lot of different companies, seed companies and such, to try and do different things, different varieties of grasses and such, when there's no experiential knowledge or technical information on the forage species. Remember that most of these grasses and such have been tested on livestock species like cattle. Expect the horse grazing pressure to be at least 20-30% more, 20 to 30% harder than ruminants. So you have to use these forage species that are unique to an area with guarded breath. So then we have to deal with stocking rate and palatability. Palatability usually takes care of itself over time. If the grass is a nutritional source and we desire them to eat it, they will adapt to the taste of that plant. But palatability does get to be an issue in management when we have multicultural forage species, because they'll preferentially take off and just consume one out of the three. Stocking rate is usually the critical issue. That is why in many parts of the country we are forced to utilize plants that will grow very close to the ground and have certain root structures that will allow them to recover from overgrazing, more so than some of the bunch grasses that we may want to use but can't because the horses, because of their grazing pressure, trampling and such, just destroy the plant. So our choices, this is kind of the outline that we have to follow, and then you just have to get your own personal list because of the area of the country. The first way we characterize or classify grasses: cool season versus warm season. In the southern part of the U.S., we're usually concentrating on a warm season base of a perennial or a grass that is going to regrow year to year, at least for 5 or 6 years before it needs much. We're going to use that as our base because 180 to 240 days out of the year, the temperature may suit that growing need for that type of, or that classification of plant. On the other hand, in the mid-U.S., where a lot of our horses are, and then moving up north to where our friends at Michigan State are right now, I'm going to say that they concentrate pretty heavily on what we would identify as cool season, understandably. Annual versus perennials. An annual grass is one that you're going to have to reseed and plant every year. Perennials you expect, unless we have done something tremendously evil to them, to return the next growing season. There are some perennials that are very sturdy to grazing pressure, i.e. Bermuda grass is one that we have here, and so that is a very true perennial in all sense. We have some perennials in this area, for example, a rye grass perennial variety that, regardless of whether or not it's identified as a perennial or not, it is not suited to the temperate environment that we have and the grazing situations that we have. And so even though it is a perennial by classification, we treat it like an annual. Well, then you have grasses and legumes, and grasses will vary. You know, we can just give the list and everybody just has their own, but Kentucky bluegrass and Dallas grass and blue stems and Bermuda grasses and orchard grasses and on and on and on are very typical grasses that are utilized throughout the U.S. Legumes are usually limited to the clovers. A lot of people will use that as a nitrogen recycling effort, so they don't have to rely on the cost of fertilizer. And of course, our alfalfa is the most commonly fed legume, but we usually harvest it and treat it as hay. Then you get into the interest of whether you want to use a single species or multiple grasses. As an example of multiple grass strategies, if we're doing a warm season perennial and we want to extend the growing season by 30 to 60 days in this part of the U.S., we will sod seed or overseed cool season mixture on top of that. We'll usually use a variety of cool season annuals, i.e. rye and ryegrass, possibly wheat, because these small grains will have different growing seasons within the cool season. Some will come on in the spring more aggressively earlier in the year. Others will come in later. So that's just an example of why you might want to even introduce multiple versus single. So let's combine it all and say that we're going to manage horses for the benefit of the grass, because this is this is, after all, a pasture management talk. So we're going to manage horses for the benefit of the grass, and we're going to have to do that by regulating access. We regulate access because of the small acreage that we're into usually. We have to regulate stocking rate, which is the hardest thing in the world for us to do usually. And then we can modify the natural grazing behavior just by adjusting the intake prior to being turned out, possibly, versus having them hungry or allowing them to be hungry, depending on what you want to see them do once they hit that grass. Our facilities are going to have to be developed to assist management of horses for the benefit of the grass. That means some cross fencing and such in most situations. And you have to think of it in terms of grass, pasture, soil types and such. That gets to be a little contrary to some of our needs that we usually design our programs around for horse traffic and movement in and out of stalls and such. And then we implement the agronomic practices that really benefit plant growth. Now, the agronomic practices that we routinely use list the number one thing that we use, and that's mowing. And then I immediately say we overuse it. My agronomist friend tells me that mowing doesn't get rid of those weeds. It just moves them closer to the ground. And with the price of diesel and the effectiveness of mowing for weed control, you really need to concentrate on your grazing management and your potential use of herbicides and such, and not expect mowing to be your answer. Now, because selective grazing and spot grazing is such a concern with most of our pastures, many times we just have to mow once or twice through the season just to bring down that undesirable grass to the level of the grass that was desirable, so we can get rid of those spots. Now, hopefully you're not using mowing as a primary way to do your manure management. If you are, then you've really got some problems of not having any grass. Herbicides are usually not something that we tend to want to use around our horses. We're scared of them because we want to treat our horses organically. We don't know for sure if it's going to hurt them or not. Basically, it's just not understood. Unfortunately, there's many situations to where we have to go in with herbicide use to establish a pasture. And in the sense of reality, annual herbicide use is not all bad. When done effectively, you can really improve the nutritional quality of the pasture and such, but for it to be done effectively, you really have to know what's going on. There are herbicides that are selective to broadleaf. There are herbicides that will take care of all the plants in the area. The old business of know the label, know what you're putting out, do not use anything off label, will keep you out of trouble. But I would recommend, if a horse owner is utilizing any level of forage and you're going to have weeds, I would recommend that you investigate the programs that are available to you to go through the course material that we that are certified applicators go through. For example, in this state, there's a self-testing procedure that requires reading and an understanding of material before you're allowed to use any restrictive herbicide. And quite honestly, most of us that have those licenses don't use restricted herbicides, but because of the locale of our horse farms to neighbors and because of the misunderstanding, that information is good for any type of chemical that you can purchase over the counter. So that's my preaching for that. Look into that, because I think you'll find it pretty interesting and valuable. Well, fertilization, usually if we have a problem with fertilization, it's just misaligned. Of course, fertilization is not near the concern now as it was 2 or 3 years ago because of the tremendous cost of nitrogen, but there are fertilization rates that are very well defined to production rates of many forages in your area. We have that information available through the Cooperative Extension Office. For example, Bermuda grass in this state, there's been so many trials done that we can pretty well put up a graph and say per ton of nitrogen or per amount of nitrogen placed on Bermuda grass. Given moisture, we're going to adjust the tonnage of Bermuda grass by this amount. We will affect the amount of biomass produced on Bermuda grass from 1 to 4 tons per acre through a growing season just by altering the amount of nitrogen on it. So look at those production goals and not place fertilizer on plants that do not respond to nitrogen supplementation. Now that soil test is going to tell you, in addition to nitrogen, what the phosphorus and potassium needs are and what pH adjustments may need done with liming or something. So all of this kind of ties into the soil test, and when you get a soil test, you'll usually get a fertilization recommendation based on whatever the common forage species is. So the less able, though, that you are at controlling grazing, the more you're going to have to rely on these agronomic practices to save your land. And unfortunately, it's save your land. So, we're getting close. Thanks for the presentation, Doc, but you really haven't answered my question. What I want to know is what's the best grass for my horses? And I think we answered that. Go down and see what grasses are going to grow first, and then start aligning those grasses with the maturity rate of the grass to the grazing pressure of the horse, and see whether or not you can align something. Which grass will my horse like better? Usually it's a factor of whether or not there's any grass out there for him to like to eat. So concentrate on production and the types of grasses that are moderately digestible and consistent in their growth. Can a horse eat too much grass? Absolutely. We didn't get into fructans and NSCs and this and that, founder issues and whatnot, but there are grass species that, in their terms of digestible energy content and availability, will be very similar to a grain type ration. So you have to treat them as you would grain. What plant should I avoid? Any plant that's going to make him sick. Now good luck with that, because they're going to colic on just about anything if the moon's right or the rain comes differently or whatnot. But for sure, avoid those that we know are problems. The fescue situation with the fungus endophyte. There are some clovers that will cause slobbers. There are some that will cause photosensitization, easy for me to say, but cause some skin problems with sunlight and such. One thing that I tell people is avoid any ornamental bush or tree that is down at that home show or home place. Avoid all of those that you would use for landscaping, because they're not introduced species. We really don't know much about them, and if it's got a berry on it, it'll probably make them sick. So just avoid those if you can. How many can I put on my pasture? You have to know stocking rate. And to know stocking rate, you're going to have to know the forage production per acre. Figure out that if it's going to produce X tons, try and salvage it by reducing your stocking rate, so your horse is only going to be required to eat 30-40% of it. Again, that's my bib overall speaking, not my hat, horseman's hat. And then expect horse intake to be around 2 to 3% of body weight per day for dry matter consumption. That's a lot of formulas and such, but I think if you go down to the county extension office, if you haven't worked with this, those guys are used to, those men and women are used to doing this pretty routinely. Well, so I'm going to leave it with you and give you some points to ponder. What's the economic benefit of improving your pasture before you do all of this? And the only way to do that is to know what your expected rate of return is going to be on forage production versus the inputs, because inputs are so expensive now. But my question to you is, what are you doing to prevent erosion, water contamination of surrounding waterways and such? We are going to be forced to manage our pastures if we are in an erosion state or we're doing something to the waterways, regardless of whether or not it's going to be cost effective. And then, do you really want to learn about pasture management? And if you do, here's our plug for our Horse Quest. There's a complete self-learning course available at the horsequest.info website, and I'd sure encourage you to do that. Well, I went a little long, but we got started a little later. I'm seeing all kinds of good answers to everything. I'm going to stay on the line, but I am going to shut up, and if someone has some text chats, I will do my best to try and answer them. And thank you all. Thank you all very much for listening to me, or at least being online.
As some of you continue to ask questions, I just want to go ahead and say that we wanted to thank Dr. Freeman for his presentation this evening. We would also like to thank all of you for your participation. Our next webcast will be on Tuesday, March 10th, 2009 at 7 p.m. Eastern Time on the topic of horse manure, a renewable resource. This webcast will be the final presentation in a three-part series on environmental issues in the horse industry. It will be presented by Dr. Ann Swinker, who is from Penn State University. For more information, visit our website at myhorseuniversity.com. Please remember that this webcast was recorded and will be uploaded to our website by the end of the week. Feel free to send us your comments and suggestions to info@myhorseuniversity.com. Thank you, and I hope you all had a great evening. And I will let this stay online for a little while as you type your questions back and forth. Thanks a lot.